I'm going to start by asking you all, just anything to jump in, any thoughts or reflections you have on your earlier conversation?
One thing I'd like to say is when we talk about a new social contract is really thinking about, is it really a new social contract we're trying to create and design? Are we kind of reverting and really looking at what has been done in the past and what we sort of ripped apart and destroyed in order for capitalism to exist, and the ways in which we're learning from and building upon, the movements of various people, not only across the world, as has been mentioned, but to indigenous folks and to people across the world who have had their lands ripped away from them, and who did work in harmony with each other and the environment, and how we can ensure that they are real, and who is with us today is really leading that charge, and that it's not just new things that we're creating and designing and developing, but things that were in existence that we've been cut and ripped away from.
So really raising the question, can we go forward without looking back at what we've destroyed in this process of colonization and racialized capitalism?
And I think part of what's new about it is reclaiming those things and then applying them in a new context. Right, the context is new. When we reclaim things and apply it to, in this case, late stage capitalism, then it is a new context. We don't have the practice of a lot of the work I do around economic democracy. We don't have that. We don't flex that muscle. Or even the very last piece of the conversation that Maurice was offering, right? Like, we haven't even been flexing our muscle of vision and even culture. Like, it's gotten that dire that we're no longer dancing and singing as part of our organizing our movements, which isn't to say that nobody is. Obviously, some of the people that I dance and sing with are in this room. But that by and large, that's been stripped from our movements, and I think that that's one of the lasting impacts of really the turn that the sort of nonprofit industrial complex and the professionalization that both Naomi and Maurice were speaking to, that's what it's left us with, right? So like, when you were, and I think you were just about to say this, like the recentering how racial capitalism is at the crux of this, and how for so long the groups who had access to space to envision and play with, whether it's ideological formation or even just intellectualism, squandered that. That because of the taint of white supremacy culture, the group of people who were able to really be the protectors of our theory, and by that I'm including even on the left, were not the people who were closest to the pain, to your point. And then it didn't matter, right? It's like we had these ideas and they didn't matter, or we were divided from one another. And so it's only through getting through that, like in order to overcome that, we got to get very, very real about solidarity. That doesn't happen when you have people who have the space of culture or ideological formation linked and in community and deeply in solidarity in a multiracial movement, and I think that's what we're trying to do.
Something is afoot in Philly, I get a sense. So what is happening? How is all this work in Philly? You're all coming from very different perspectives, yet you're all here in the same conversation. How are communities in Philly imagining the transformation of our systems in a different future?
My name is Nancy again, and I'm here representing, or I was asked to speak about the work of the Alliance for Just Philadelphia. I'm a little bit, I don't know if it was cut, but just because I have folks sitting in the row that are here from my organization, I'm the executive director and co-founder of Viet Lead, an organization in Philadelphia that we're co-creating together as a vehicle to actually do so much of what y'all have talked about, like centering resilience-based organizing, centering our cultural practices not as sort of like a backward or historical thing, but sort of like as the center and place where we could imagine where we want to go forward. But the Alliance for Just Philadelphia is sort of both a reflection on what y'all were talking about and sort of me thinking now, I'm like, man, if I didn't feel urgent before, I feel much more urgent now. Which is, it's an experiment. Almost 30 grassroots, base building, Black and brown and immigrant refugee-led organizations and groups across Philadelphia, across 13 issue areas. We've been we've been brought together in the same room, probably now for about a year, to try to figure out how to coordinate our issue area wins, which are ways that we can flex our muscle in the city, but do this in a way that we're intervening in this electoral sense, so that we can inspire and instill, or so that we can figure out how to flex our governing muscle vis-a-vis the current government, right? So, or the current city council. I guess just a couple of things historically, which is this is the latest iteration of multiple attempts to do this. Okay. So just calling about history, it's I'm 37, I've been in the city of Philadelphia for 10 years, this is my third try. And just me, right? And I feel like we're trying to do this because collectively we have been brought up in this very particular political moment where we now as leftists in Philadelphia understand not just how power is working, but what it means to try to build our power in this political moment and exercise it in the arena of the city, right? And it's so much, like you said, it's not necessarily, it's not, my parents are refugees from Vietnam. I'm first generation in the United States. I'm here, and all of the folks in my community, 58% are limited English speaking. When we think about what does it mean to lead and govern in a city in the United States, in Philadelphia, these are not practices that folks in my community are connected to. And so I think it's however, when we're in the room together, and I'm going long, but I'll try to keep it short. When we're in the room together to try to, I think it's we're bringing, the idea is that we're bringing all of our people to try to practice and experiment with this idea and figure out how to do it in a way where we can be practicing solidarity with each other and practicing what it means to move together and bringing all the lessons of how we either failed or made missteps in the past. So this is the latest iteration. Good luck to all of us in this room. But just that the resiliency and the capacity of us to keep trying and keep going, that's what it is about in Philadelphia now too.
How many Philadelphians here think she's going to succeed this time around? So Kris, I'm going to throw the next question to you because you've been fighting criminalization. And that sort of raises for me a question of, can we go forward without looking back at all the harm we've done? Do we have to repair the past to move into the future?
The short answer is absolutely.
The long answer?
I think the longer answer is, when we're looking at the criminal legal system, it is its purpose is to punish people, is to if someone harms someone, ideally, is in the best case scenario in the criminal legal system. If someone harms someone else, we find the person that's responsible and then we punish them. And that's literally the best thing that we can hope for. What actually happens is that there are all of these factors that our system doesn't look at. Why this person might have done that, what things that person might need that they didn't have. And prison is actually not at all designed to make sure that people get those things. The extent to which people come out of prison and are great people who can contribute to our communities, it's completely outside of what the criminal legal system is actually trying to do. And so we can't just say, hey, we're not gonna do it anymore, and now everything's fixed. It's there are all of these people who have been that just sort of ground up in this system where they haven't got the things that they've needed, and then they've just sort of like been punished, and like they still don't have the things that they need, and like that's not even looking at, that's just looking at people who like committed harm, or like are convicted of having committed some harm. Like we're not even talking about the people who have been harmed and what they actually need, because the criminal legal system at best gives them like the opportunity to punish someone, but like doesn't actually care about like people healing or like what things they've like lost and need to like regain or gain they never had. And like, you know, it also doesn't look at our communities and what our communities need. And like this idea that like when someone in our community is harmed, it's not just that person, it's not just their family, it's like this like larger ecosystem of like all of us that is like impacted by that. And so like all of this harm just kind of like begets more harm. And so we can't just say, oh, cool, we're gonna stop doing that. We have to actually fix like every layer of that in order to hopefully get to like some better system.
So Esteban, I'm going to take the next question over to you, in part because I read, I think somewhere in one of the organization's reports that the worker co-op movement was seen, had been sort of more recently seen as a sort of white space, but that in fact historically that was not the case. And that efforts by people of color to work cooperatively were sort of directly challenged and undermined. And there's a resurgence of interest, in part because people have been brutally criminalized, excluded from traditional forms of employment, and the data shows that jobs actually are the one thing that consistently reduces crime in any community. So I just want you to sort of comment on how do your efforts fit into building the alternative, creating space for those who've been harmed, and by providing it, and within this economic democracy. I would just love to hear your reflections on that.
Yeah, so that's helpful, because I was starting to spin out, thinking about all the work that I do related to what Kris was just talking about with restorative justice and transformative justice stuff, because, you know, the thing about having a conversation like this locally that's different than when I leave town and have conversations like this is it invites in more of our community and more of the stories of how I'm actually involved in so many different cross-cutting issues, and I think that really gets to the heart of you know, what does it look like to start practicing this stuff, to start winning? It's much more comprehensive. So yeah, just flipping just that angle on my role, organizing the worker co-op movement, particularly here in the U.S., and how that connects to this broader political project. I think you're right in a sense, but I think one of the things that's shifting is that the moment when cooperatives generally and worker co-ops kind of as part of that were seen as a primarily white thing, coincided with kind of an aberration historically. It was just one moment where it was seen as an alternative, a way to opt out of the traditional economy. And what's shifting is that now it's seen as a way to opt in for people who've been shut out, locked out, marginalized in various ways, including people with criminal records, people who don't have documentation and papers to work. Otherwise, that worker cooperatives are now being used and iterated on in a diversity of different strategies of how we formulate business formations that are worker-owned in order to get access to either a new type of market or for people who, whether they're doing domestic work, home cleaning, and even stuff related to the new kind of energy democracy, renewable, sustainable, green jobs and businesses that are part of what was left out in how traditional capitalist industries have branched out economically, right? And so there's gaps in that market. The spaces of innovations are more around people in worker cooperative spaces. Part of the idea is that when labor actually not just seizes control adversarially against management or against owners, but actually seizes the means of production, seizes the apparatus of management inside of their workplaces, then it's a whole different calculus, right? And so it's not just about what is a sort of way to gamify and get access to gainful jobs or employment, but also we're talking about how worker ownership is one of the primary ways for communities of color to build assets in the 21st century economy, that it addresses an increasing racialized wealth gap, that it's one of the primary ways that especially Black people, but for communities of color, to be able to gain an asset in a market that is shut out, gentrifying, displacing communities of color from home ownership, which traditionally was the primary way of getting access to wealth building or to an asset in the economy. So that is kind of to your earlier point, a return, right? That cooperation, whether it was through lending and susus, whether it was through a long and deep history of communities of color practicing, owning and controlling their own businesses, that were returning and reclaiming those practices, which in fact were erased by mostly white professionals, by histories that were told, by academics, by cooperative leaders throughout sort of the middle of the 20th century. And partially that was an erasure that had to do with the divide and conquer racial capitalism in that moment, the 20th century, as a way of dividing and conquering people, said, well, you know what? You can't fight for racial justice and civil rights at the same time that you're also fighting for these economic rights. And so there was a tacit survival strategy among Black organizers in the U.S. to start keeping quiet about all of the deep history of solidarity, economic organizing and practice that had been happening in our country. So everyone that you know about, from organizing civil rights stuff, from Fannie Lou Hamer to Ella Baker, Philip Randolph, all of them were organizing worker-owned cooperatives throughout the early 20th century, and that was suppressed because Black people couldn't possibly face the twin attacks of McCarthyism and all the attacks that were happening around socialist practices and institutions, while simultaneously facing the Klan and facing anti-Black racism and an attack on civil rights. And so that absolutely was part of our history that we're just starting to now reclaim and retell. And thankfully, we're lucky to be organizing as a grassroots membership-based organization, in the case of the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, where all of our leaders are Black, brown, immigrants, people of color. 2/3 of our board are actually Spanish-speaking, and a lot of our staff, all of our staff directors are people of color. Many of us come from immigrant backgrounds like myself, also first generation. My family's also from the Caribbean. And so this is the new face of this organizing. Definitely the growing edge of how we're seeing the economic response to democratic socialism and to linking and solidarity with movements around the world, around what it looks like during this particular moment of pushing back against right-wing populism with a left-wing response to that.
So Nora, I'm going to turn to you because development, equitable development, kind of touches everything, right? It touches how we're governed, it touches how we might decriminalize, it touches how we work. And Philly, like many cities, has suffered displacement instead of development, in lieu of development, and wealth concentration. How do you feel your work connects to everything else you've been hearing? In particular, how it connects to the climate work you're doing as well.
Yeah, so looking at equitable development and thinking about that, it's really, part of it is putting people back into development. So much of what's already been said is that the focus is profit, it's building, it's these things. But in a city like Philadelphia, when there is a desire for increased population, when there's plenty of vacant land, plenty of vacant buildings, why is there even a question of displacement happening? When we can see equitable development is also about looking at and breaking down those silos, not just as activists, but as well as not just as activists, but also in terms of looking at the structures of our systems. When we shut down 23 schools, public schools, and hand those properties over to developers who are creating luxury housing and then asking the questions, why is there this or that or the other? You know, that's the basis, that's the foundation, right? In allowing for and accessing the education across the board, no matter what neighborhood you live in, no matter what community you live in. But you can see the movement of those resources in different ways while still asking the questions, why does this happen? Why does that happen? When we have the research and the solutions for all of these things. So how are we putting them into practice? How are we doing that with our putting new people into city council, for instance? And so like was already been mentioned earlier, it is necessary to do this in so many different layers and levels. And so how are we doing that in some of the work we're doing to address climate issues? So I'm one of many members of the Philadelphia Climate Works Coalition, and that coalition is led by Zakia Elliott, who's a part of Sierra Club. And this work is around bringing people who don't typically sit at the table together, so labor groups and environmental justice concerns and issues and things like that, and having conversations to look at the shared commonalities, the shared goals, the shared, the shared ways that we can see common outcomes from different places. So in the case of climate, bringing together people in conversation. A lot of people complain about trash, for instance, in the neighborhood, right? And bringing the questions around trash, but in conversation about sanitation workers, right? And the rights of sanitation workers, and tying that to history, but looking at and bringing people in conversation with each other to understand what sanitation workers actually face in their jobs, that their jobs are. And so it's highlighting the different ways that we're all playing different parts and connect together. And that's one example. But Philadelphia Climate Works is also looking at transit equity. What does that mean? Looking again historically at the different ways that people have fought for access to transit and what it means to have truly accessible public transit that takes us where we need, but also in thinking about having opportunities to design new solutions, making sure that our transit systems are following environmental standards, that we can, that when we're buying new or making new, that we're not doing it in the same old way, which, to go back to my earlier point about education, what are we actually teaching in our schools, which is where most of our young people spend their time. We know that there are various ways that we teach about who we are as citizens in our society, and so that is also a basis.
I think something Naomi would describe as integrated solutions
Absolutely.
to our multiple crises and problems. So I appreciate you both staying here a little longer. So I wanted to, before we get to a little closeout for Mo and then Q&A, I wanted to ask both of you. So you have a national perch, actually a global perch, right, and perspective. How do you see the link to work? How do you see the solutions you're trying to promote on this sort of very large stage, linking to work that's happening in places like Philadelphia and what you're hearing today?
Yeah, it's wonderful to hear all that. I honestly think that Philadelphia has some of the most exciting organizing going on anywhere. And it's so... And just that difficult work of those unexpected partnerships, those difficult conversations, and as you said, trying for the third time, right? I mean, there's something to me so inspiring about that, because this is not easy work, and it isn't easy because there's difficult history, and it is, and conflicting interests in lots of ways, and it's always easier to walk away from the table than to come back to it and try again. And so the fact that this is happening and that there are all these different tables in the city where people are trying to actually solve and work through this, and learn from mistakes and make new mistakes is really exciting and not something that is happening everywhere, right? So I think that Philadelphia really does have an opportunity to lead by example. I don't love when people talk about the U.S. leading by example, because I think it's a bit late for that. I think the U.S., when it comes to climate, needs to lead by like putting some serious cold hard cash on the table and cutting back the military, justice for migrants, things like that. So I don't think there's any sort of shining city on the hill for the U.S. as a nation. But I do think that a city like Philadelphia has so much to teach. And in part maybe because it has been out of the spotlight and the focus, and people have had to organize in new and creative ways. But the fact is, we do need all levels of government to get things done on the kind of deadline that we're talking about. But so many of what we think of as of transformational climate policy actually plays out at the local level, right? Where we get our energy, how we live in cities, if we're going to live densely, how we move ourselves around, these core transit questions, whether we're going to have green gentrification or whether we're actually going to figure out how to live together, right? And I think cities model this because the truth is that the space where it is possible for humans to live on this planet is contracting. So we're all going to have to figure out how to share. Or else we're just going to hoard and build fortresses. And that's, that is something else that we're seeing. So yeah, I'm just going to be staying tuned because, also when I look around the world, I think cities are already leading in really exciting ways, whether it's Barcelona under Ada Colau and the super blocks and taking back parts of the city from cars, or some of what's been happening in other European cities with actually having green affordable housing in the downtown core and not pushing people out of cities, or free transit. I mean, these are core climate solutions. And cities can't do it on their own, but I think cities can really develop the agenda and develop the constituency that is demanding it, right? Because this is, I think, part of the biggest problem we've had when it comes to people imagining that we could rise to this crisis, is that people have associated climate action with this sort of free market so-called solutions that have just made life more expensive for people for a long time, right? There's a reason why people think of green issues as something that you care about if you don't have anything better to care about, right? Because pretty consistently, green policies have been, increase people's cost of living, people's electricity costs, people's transit costs, and that's what kicked things off in Chile, right? They electrified the bus system and then increased fares, right? And it's not that people don't want green transit, it's that they're not going to pay the bill for a crisis that they didn't create. And so I think that one thing I would just offer maybe as my final contribution, and I don't know if it might be useful, this is something Todd Wilson was going to be here tonight and sadly wasn't able to be here because he threw his back out. But Todd has done great organizing around the gig economy. And one of the things that Todd and I talk about is that our current economy is like a gig and dig economy, right? That is all about maximal extraction from people and planet, and then just throwing both away. As if there is no limit, as if there is no consequence for the destruction of people's lives and of the natural systems on which all of life depends, right? It's that ultimate short-term thinking at the heart of both the gig economy and the dig economy. And so in thinking together with lots of other people about what embodies the next economy, I love the phrase that we are moving from this gig and dig economy to an economy based on care and repair. And the care piece we've talked about, the repair work being low carbon work, overwhelmingly women's work, overwhelmingly immigrant women's work, which is systematically devalued because it is immigrant women's work. And what if those were well-paying jobs? What if we actually valued the work of care? But thinking about repair, I think, is a really generative idea because there's a lot of repair that we have to do, and it also creates work. Like repairing what we have done to the earth, that's a pretty big green job, you know? So it isn't just making new stuff, it's also just cleaning up the mess that has been left behind that we need to do, and also, you know, the kind of reforestation and rewilding and habitat restoration that needs to happen because climate isn't the only crisis we face. We also face an extinction crisis. And we also need to learn to repair our stuff so that we don't just like consume and throw away, which is at the heart of this crisis. As much as we try to change the subject to just buying new green things, we actually just can't just have the disposable culture that we have. But then obviously the third repair is the repair that you've all been talking about, which is repairing our relationships. And dating back to the founding of our countries. And I don't think we move forward without that repair. So I really do think that reparation work, that sort of triple restoration, and I'm sure there's lots of restorations that I have, reparations that I have, restorations and reparations that I haven't even mentioned. But I feel like that maybe could be a helpful framing for some glue that can keep us at the table doing this really, really difficult work when we want to run away because it's hard. So, thanks.
Thank you. And I've been asked to close this out, so I'll wrap the answer in that. So I want to thank you, Naomi, thank Nancy, Kris, Esteban, Nora, and of course, Cathy, thank you so much for holding us to this. And thank you all for joining us. So if you're coming out of this conversation alarmed, good. Our conditions are alarming. The connection between climate change-induced migration from poor, predominantly black and brown countries with ascending white nationalism in Europe and the European settler colonies foretells a future of climate catastrophe, democratic collapse, and possibly globalized race war. If Trump's right-wing populism appeared for a time to at least partly speak to genuine economic hardship, ever since he turned his policy agenda over to Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, and an army of corporate lobbyists, he has revealed himself surely to be motivated only by two things. First of all, his own personal enrichment, right? And secondly, a fulminating white grievance politics, anchored in ideas about white replacement, that shades easily into open white supremacism. For Trump and for other right-wing parties across the globe, their populism increasingly assumes overtly racist forms, often in the guise of so-called welfare chauvinism. That is, a blatant ranking of human life based on race and citizenship status. White nationalism will take the reality of nature's limits as an argument for us to use the force in order to hoard whatever resources we can command. And this is eco-fascism. It will threaten wars, especially with China, and that's happening now. And while it may still traffic in denunciations of shadowy, presumably Jewish globalist elite, it will not offer any material improvements in its constituents' lives. Instead, it will offer the psychic compensations of racial and gender violence. Unless they are interrupted, white nationalism combined with the intensification of the climate and migration crises will lead more and more to authoritarian rule and the militarized nature of everyday life, with dire consequences for those of us who are either marked as outsiders from the start or choose never to submit to live under the system. All the while, the billionaires will continue their looting. They will sooner invest in private armies and marching colonies than consent to their wealth being appropriated for the sake of the planet and the people on it. We know that centrism cannot save us. Even as most mainstream Democratic politicians come to the realization that neoliberalism is an electoral dead end, they continue to play to elite audiences. What for them passed as bold ideas wouldn't alter the reality of diminished life prospects for the majority of the US population. And voters are not done. We are not done. We see this. If we have 4 years of Democratic control, so that means Trump is defeated, and no significant material improvement in the lives of most Americans, it could easily be followed by a right-wing presidency, even scarier than the one we currently have, since that right-wing presidency likely would be competent. In this context, those of us who consider ourselves part of the left need to be very clear about our task. The role of the left isn't simply to consolidate the left. The role of the left is to organize the working class. So the task of the left at this juncture is to build and lead the broadest possible front of popular forces in a project of transforming the American state, from one organized around capital accumulation without limit to one organized around mobilizing our collective capacities to green the earth and ensure the well-being of all people. We need to transform our nation with a politics rooted in dignity and solidarity and generosity and, yes, love, not greed and division, hate, extraction, and war. A nation where every single one of us can thrive should be our common sense and our North Star. At least one path may get us there, the multiracial populism. I think, Esteban, you were talking about this multiracial alignment that we need to build. What populism means to me is that we should be working to build broad, durable majorities around a political program that directly challenges the power of the ruling class and their white Christian nationalist allies and points towards liberation for everybody. I think we build durable majorities by offering clear solutions to real problems in people's lives. So the fact that we're talking about wiping out student debt, the fact that we're talking about a Green New Deal, the fact that we're talking about abolishing private health care, these are opportunities to bring working people into the door. But then we have a second duty. Once folks get in the door, we need to do something that the right has done for much better and for decades, which is to invest in our people's political education over the long term. People know that things are badly broken, but we must help them create the conditions so that they can understand how and why and what to do about it. One of the things that we at the Working Families Party are working to do is to educate people about the greatest political challenges that we face, which is the greatest political challenge of our life and of our people's lives for generations, racial capitalism. This term gets invoked more and more, but not always with precision. My own view is that racial capitalism is a system in which race functions to establish material and status hierarchies within the broad working class. Specifically under racial capitalism, all workers are exploited, all of us across race. But black and brown workers are exploited, excluded, surveilled, dispossessed, incarcerated, sometimes killed. White workers are treated as full citizens, at least, with protection of laws, and large apparatuses devoted to facilitating the participation in at least some of the material benefits of American capitalism. The material discrepancies that I talked about are vast and they build over generations. Witness the racial wealth gap that we talked about. But they also generate particular political pathologies. Specifically, they give rise to the profound conviction on the part of many, many white Americans that any program that will uplift all working class people must inevitably come at their expense. This fear that equality for all represents a loss for some, even if it would make them materially better off, is an acute challenge for all of us, everybody that's trying to organize a multiracial movement, especially when a majority of white Americans are seeing their living standards erode. Under racial capitalism, the solidarities of whiteness and patriarchy, saturated with chauvinistic nationalism, always potentially compete with the solidarity of class. In his open invitation, Trump's open invitation to participate in the solidarity of whiteness, Trump has exploited this latent possibility like few other politicians in our history. And in the process, he has shown just how powerful it really can be. Its appeal, the solidarity of whiteness, its appeal cuts right through the electoral coalition that many of us are trying to build through Nick and Kendra's campaign. And we have to figure out this vexing organizing challenge. To me, the multiracial part of multiracial populism means that we will only build a powerful working class majority in this country by talking honestly about race and racism and not avoiding the subject. My friend Heather McKee makes this point with a memorable story. In the South, during the Civil Rights era, segregationists defunded, drained, and closed the public swimming pools rather than allow black people to swim together with whites. Now, no one can swim in them, white or black. These pools, literally and metaphorically, have never been refilled. Now, only the wealthy with a private pool or country club can go swimming. This happens all the time in less visible ways, and when we talk to white people about it, they know it's true because they too have suffered the consequences of this decades-long program of starving public goods for private gain. When we are silent and people are insecure, scared about what their slice might look like as the pie shrinks, the outcome isn't good for our side. We have no choice but to expose the right's racist tactics, to show how they've been used to divide and conquer, and to drain the public pool for all of us. They say there isn't enough to go around, and someone else might get their share. If we don't address it with our own story, theirs will prevail. We need to tell our story, how they are stealing what belongs to all of us, our public good, and putting us against one another, so that we could ignore what is common amongst all of us. This is a political tactic of the right, and the only way we could challenge it is by confronting white supremacy. The good news is that this political moment, for all of its dangers, has created unusually favorable conditions. The Trump presidency has radicalized liberals and electoralized radicals. Yeah, this space is a case in point. And my own view is that we need to marry the creative brilliance of movements, their ability to render the invisible visible and make the impossible possible, with the power, rigor, and leadership development of labor and people's organizations. And that's what makes what's happening right now in Philadelphia so exciting. Y'all are doing that. This is why the work that's happening in Philadelphia is a national priority, for example, the Working Families Party. We need to give that marriage a political home, build on deep trust that can bring our whole self into that picture. That doesn't ask anybody to sacrifice your politics. That home needs to be a place where all of these forces can fashion non-delusional strategies for winning elections everywhere in America. That is, in any event, what we're aspiring at least to do at the Working Families Party. Now, we'd be the last to deny that there are built-in contradictions to such an enterprise. But in the case of Kendra Brooks and Nicholas O'Rourke, wherever you are, okay, are two at-large candidates for Philly, you have two brilliant examples of what all of that might look like, not just here in Philadelphia, but all over the country. Candidates who are fighting to bring the Green New Deal local through transformational climate ordinances. Candidates who, and this is key, are building the kind of grassroots infrastructure in Pennsylvania that we talked about, that we know will defeat Trumpism in 2020. So I want to thank you so much on behalf of the Working Families Party and all of us. Thank you.